welcome and thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Dan Sutter, the Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union 2 years later seemingly marked the demise of socialism. The idea of government planning of the economy, billed as scientific socialism, and the application of systematic rationality to economic affairs at the start of the 20th century seemed consigned to the dustbin of history. Yet in 2016, Vermont Senator and self-described socialist Bernie Sanders received over 40% of the votes in the Democratic primaries. And then in 2018, candidates aligned with the Democratic Socialists of America did surprisingly and unexpectedly well, with most notably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being elected to Congress from New York. Today, polls show almost equal support for socialism and capitalism amongst people under age 30. A recent New York Magazine article asked, when did everyone become socialist? So what has happened, and what should we make of today's rise of socialism from the dead? And what does socialism even mean in America today? To explore this question, we invited two prolific and nationally renowned scholars here at Troy University. Bryan Caplan, sitting on the far right there, is a professor of economics at George Mason University. Professor Caplan earned his PhD from Princeton University and is the author of more than 40 scholarly articles and 4 books: The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, and Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. He's also a noted blogger and blogs at EconLog. Seated next to Professor Caplan is Dr. John Marsh. He's an associate professor of English at Penn State University and holds a PhD from the University of Illinois. He is the author of 3 books: Hog Butchers, Beggars, and Busboys, Poverty and Labor in the Making of Modern American Poetry. Another book, Class Dismissed, Why We Cannot Teach or Learn Our Way Out of Inequality. And finally, In Walt We Trust, How a Queer Socialist Poet Can Save America from Itself. He was also an editor of an award-winning anthology of American labor poetry titled You Work Tomorrow. He also has 2 new books that are coming out soon, The Emotional Life of the Great Depression and The Puzzle of Poetry. They will appear over the next 2 years. So we've welcomed we've brought these 2 scholars from Pennsylvania and Virginia here to Troy to talk to us about this topic here today. We sort of flipped a coin before the talk today, and so Dr. Caplan is going to give the first opening statement. They're going to each give opening statements here at the podium. Then they'll each then respond to each other. I'll ask them some questions. Then we'll have some time to take some audience questions, wrap up with closing statements, and we should be done by 11:15, okay? And if you're here for extra credit, sign-in sheets and QR codes to scan will be available after the lecture, okay? Well, Dr. Caplan.
Thank you very much. Capitalism and socialism, what do these words even mean? You could just say that capitalism is the economic system of countries like the United States, and socialism is the economic system of countries like the former Soviet Union. In that case, I say capitalism is at least okay, while socialism is hell on earth. It's more fruitful, though, to treat capitalism and socialism as ideal positions, or as positions on the ideal economic system. Something like the capitalist ideal is that government plays very little role in the economy, and the socialist ideal is that government plays the leading role in the economy. In that case, I say that capitalism is awesome and socialism is terrible. What is so awesome about the capitalist ideal? It's a system based on individual freedom and voluntary consent. Under capitalism, people decide how people use their freedom is up to them. They can try to get rich, they can relax, they can help the poor, all 3, or none of the above. A society by consent. Capitalism is such a compelling moral ideal that I'm tempted to rest my case right now, but there's a looming doubt. Is capitalism one of those ideals that sounds wonderful, but works terribly in real life? How can we even begin to answer such a sprawling question? Simple. Let's start by looking at the most capitalist countries that actually exist. Next, let's weigh the probable effects of the main policy reforms required to bring those countries into harmony with the capitalist ideal. By the usual rankings, the world's most capitalist countries are Hong Kong and Singapore, and other exemplars include the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. By world and historic standards, all are incredibly rich and pleasant countries. Even their poor have such a nice life that people around the world eagerly immigrate in order to get hard, low-skilled jobs there. What is their secret? Free markets channel the fundamental human desire to better oneself in socially productive ways. If you can deliver a product that people like at a price they find attractive, you get rich. This doesn't just lead to mountains of cheap, amazing products, it also leads to constant innovation, a ceaseless effort to do more with less. To repeat, none of the world's most capitalist countries actually really live up to the capitalist ideal, but they still provide a useful benchmark. How is the status quo likely to change if government's role drastically shrinks, which is what I favor? Here are just some highlights. Number one, even the most capitalist countries heavily restrict immigration. If these laws were repealed, as they should in an actual capitalist society, there would be massive international migration. People around the world would move from countries where their labor produces very little to countries where their labor produces much. Standard long-run estimate is this would double the production of the world, right, and drastically reduce global poverty and inequality in the process. Second, even the most capitalist countries tightly regulate construction, especially in high-wage areas like New York, San Francisco, San Jose. If these laws were repealed, there would be a massive increase in the supply of housing in the most prosperous areas of the country, soon followed by massive intra-national migration as people move to places with newly affordable housing and high wages. Three, even most capitalist countries engage in massive involuntary redistribution. But most of the spending is wasted on programs like Social Security and Medicare. That's right, you heard me, wasted. Why wasted? Because these programs help everyone, and it's wasteful to help everyone. No one who is running a charity would say, I'm going to give money to everyone. Right? Instead, you would target it to people that actually need the money, but actual government systems of redistribution in order to get demagogic appeal. Give the money to everyone, which means you need enormously high taxes to pay for it. Right? And why is it wasteful? Because most people are perfectly able to take care of themselves. They don't need the government's help. So what the programs do is take money from everyone and then give it back to everyone with a lot of waste in the process. All right, now, what's so terrible about the socialist ideal? It's a system based on authority and coercion. Socialists like to compare society to a family, but in actual families, you don't have to support your siblings if you don't want to. You don't even have to support your parents who gave you life. So why should your moral obligations to complete strangers be any stronger? Once again, though, there is a looming doubt. Is socialism one of those ideals that sounds terrible but works out wonderfully in real life? To resolve this, let's take a look at actual socialist countries. All right, by usual rankings, the world's most socialist countries are North Korea and Venezuela. No decent socialist upholds these countries, these hell states, as ideals, and I'm certainly not accusing my opponent of doing so. He said his ideal is something more like Sweden or Denmark. So what's so bad about that? Well, here's my answer. Sweden and Denmark aren't that bad because Sweden and Denmark aren't that socialist, right? So in the latest economic freedom of the world statistics, the US scores 8 out of 10, and Sweden scores 7.4 out of 10. The main difference between the US and Sweden is this. Sweden wastes even more money helping everyone, even though most people are perfectly able to take care of themselves, right? And as a result, they have sky-high tax rates to pay for the waste. But isn't Sweden just plainly a nicer country than the United States? Well, I've been there a couple times, and it sure looks mediocre to me, right? Even their fancy grocery stores don't hold a candle to Walmart. And furthermore, before you praise Swedish policies as being responsible for anything good going on in Sweden, note that Swedish Americans are far more prosperous than Swedish Swedes. The simplest explanation is that Swedish culture partially offsets the harm of Sweden's distinctive policies. People often insist that true socialism has never been tried. I'm not going to say this because I don't think true capitalism has been tried either. But the problem with countries like the US is not that they are too capitalist. The problem is that they're already too like Sweden. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks, everyone, for coming. In a moment, I will argue that socialism offers a better chance at achieving a just, fair, and sustainable world than capitalism alone does. Before I do that, though, we need to get our terms straight. What do we mean by socialism? Your dictionary will tell you that socialism refers to any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. But I do not think that that definition captures what most people now mean when they talk about socialism. In fact, I know it doesn't. A recent Gallup poll found that 37% of Americans have a positive image of socialism. Among those aged 18 to 29, the share is even higher at 51%. Yet another Gallup poll found that most Americans do not understand socialism as government ownership or control. Rather, they understand it as equality or benefits and services. When it comes to language, I am a descriptivist rather than a prescriptivist. If enough people want to use hopefully to mean it is to be hoped that, hopefully we win tomorrow, rather than in a hopeful manner, hopefully I open the letter, so be it. This is the English professor in me coming out. Language evolves. For now, then, let us accept that socialism can mean either collective ownership or control or equality and services and benefits. In truth, the latter should be called social democracy and its proponents social democrats, but so what? After all, socialists and social democrats do agree that capitalism needs to change, and that agreement can paper over a lot of differences. So much for definitions. Now comes the important question. Why do socialists think capitalism needs to change? What is wrong with capitalism that only socialism can fix? In brief, capitalism needs to change because it creates problems that it will not and likely cannot solve on its own. And here's a very short list. Number one, economic insecurity. According to a recent study by the Federal Reserve, 40% of Americans, 40%, have so little in savings right now that they cannot pay for a $400 emergency expense, a car repair, a broken appliance, a visit to the dentist. They could not pay for this expense without going into debt. I think we can do better. Number two, unequal opportunity. In a just world, the circumstances of your birth, your race, your gender, and above all, the socioeconomic status of the family you were born into, these would not determine or overly determine your life chances. In the United States today, however, they very much do. Want to know whether an 8th grader will eventually graduate from college? As sociologists have demonstrated, you can make the best guess not by looking at their grades or their performance on standardized tests, but at what, sadly, matters even more, how much money their parents make. We can do better. Number three, income inequality. As possibly everyone knows by now, the income and wealth of the top 1% has soared over the past decade, soared over the past 4 decades. The problem is less that the 1% have done so well, why would we care, than that by doing so well, they have kept others from doing well. They are like a giant sponge sucking up economic growth. Between 1993 and 2017, the top 1% of earners captured 51% of overall economic growth, a half. That left 49% for everyone else. In fact, though, everyone else did not share equally in that 49%. From 1980 to 2017, the income of the bottom 50% of earners, rose by, wait for it, 1 lousy percent. As far as the bottom 50% are concerned, that is, the economy has not grown at all since 1980. Over that same period, by contrast, the average annual income for the top 1% of earners has tripled, rising from $486,000 in 1980 to $1.4 million by 2017. In short, the economy grows, but fewer people share in that growth than ever before. We can do better. Number 4, plutocracy. You may wonder why, when an overwhelming majority of Americans, including 58% of Republicans, favor raising the minimum wage nevertheless remains stuck at $7.25 an hour. Or why, when an overwhelming majority of Americans, including 46% of Republicans, think the rich should pay more in taxes, Congress cuts the taxes of the rich. Wonder no more. As several different political scientists have recently shown, if the wealthy support a policy, it stands a good chance of becoming law. If the wealthy oppose a policy or are indifferent to it, regardless of how many other Americans support it, then it stands little to no chance of becoming law. And guess how a majority of the wealthy feel about raising the minimum wage and taxing the rich. You may or may not think that we should do these things. You may oppose them. But you ought to worry about what it means for democracy when the wealthy rule and overrule everyone else. The Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis had it right. He said, we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. I prefer democracy. Finally, ecological catastrophe. As you may know, both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United States government recently issued reports concluding that global warming will arrive sooner, it has already arrived, and transform the climate more than even most scientists previously thought. Yet the United States does nothing. It does worse than nothing. Why? Partly to pick up on the theme of plutocracy, because the wealthy do not consider global warming a very important problem as of yet, and partly because thus far the desire for profit has smothered the concern for sustainability. Under capitalism, no one ever leaves money on the table, or in this case underground, unless someone stops them. We can and we must do better. I know we can do better because unlike with government ownership or control of the means of production, which few countries, none in fact, Bryan's right, have thus far made work, we do have the example of many countries that have solved or mitigated the crises I describe above. To put my cards on the table, I want the United States to look more like Denmark. Not exactly like Denmark, I think we can do better, but a lot like Denmark, with its mix of free markets, work incentives, sturdy safety nets, relative equality, regulated elections, and its commitment to a habitable earth. That is the only way to save capitalism from itself. And pay no mind to those who say the United States cannot afford such a state, or that it would kill off growth. The Danish are doing just fine, better in fact than most Americans. I may not always admire, but I do respect the virtues of capitalism that Adam Smith first described: self-interest, competition, accumulation. I respect as well how capitalism combines incentives, local knowledge, and markets to generate efficiency and innovation. And I respect, finally, how these principles specifically, and capitalism generally, have lifted billions of people out of poverty. That is why I'm a social democrat and not a socialist. In the United States of the past few decades, however, capitalism has too often worked for the few rather than for the many. As a socialist, as a social democrat, I want to reverse that trend. I want capitalism to work for everyone, from the bottom 1% to the top 1%. If we can do that, it won't much matter what people call us. Thank you.
Okay, and now we're going to have each of our speakers respond to the opening statements that they had prepared and we had shared with each other ahead of time. So Bryan is going to respond first to John, and then I'll have John respond to Bryan's opening statement.
So I agree with a shocking amount of what John said. Actually, I would say my ideal is precisely capitalism that works for everyone. My big disagreement is that John doesn't look at the current society and say, are there any government regulations that are causing these problems? Instead, he takes for granted that it's the result of free markets working normally, and I say that's just wrong. All right, so if we're going to talk about the rise in inequality, there's a lot of economists who've worked on this, many of them, Democrats and liberal, who say a very large cause of the rise in inequality just comes from regulation of housing. Right now, there is a very large share of the increase in wealth comes from rising real estate values in the very high wage areas of the country. Again, New York, New Jersey, San Francisco, San Jose. Those are the high wage areas. They're the expensive places to live. Why don't people move there? Because now when you move there, it's so expensive that it eats up the wage gains. Used to be that you actually could go and get a large raise by moving from, say, Mississippi to San Francisco. That's no longer true anymore unless you already are very high skilled. So I say, capitalism works for everyone means deregulating housing, reducing zoning, reducing regulation of land use, so that capitalism can go and build a whole lot of housing in order to open up not only affordable housing to people, but also to open up access to good jobs. Similarly, when he talks about how horrible it is that people's lives are determined by things outside of their choice, like you didn't choose the right parents, that's what immigration restrictions are all about. And what are immigration restrictions? They are a huge kind of regulation that is poured over the labor market. I see. So I actually have a new book coming out, mentioned Open Borders. Right? So even though people think of Republicans as the free market party, open immigration is the free market policy. It's the policy of allowing anyone to work anywhere. That is what capitalism is all about. So if you're concerned about people all over the world whose poverty is makes any kind of American trouble look like nothing, if you care about them, just opening up the opportunity for them to come and legally work in the U.S. and enjoy the better life they can get from that is very much the kind of thing that you should have in mind. All right, so anyway, there are many free market reforms that we can do for socialist aims. Let's see. So we said we have 3 minutes, right? So let's see. Now, all this aside, so like I'm all in favor of any kind of deregulation to go and move the world in the direction that John's talking about, and I think that there are large regulatory changes that we can do that would be both much more capitalist and lead to far more opportunity, far less inequality, better lives for many people who've been frozen out of the gains. At the same time, though, you might say, all right, fine, after we do all that, Bryan, then what? Then is John right? And that's where I will say that there is a fundamental problem that John seems to have with personal responsibility. All right, when someone says, I can't afford a $400 repair, all right, now I can imagine a situation where that's totally not your fault, but in the United States, that normally is your fault, right? If I were to go to their house, would I be able to look around and see $400 of non-essential purchases that they've made? Almost certainly. If you think about family members that you have who have hit you up for money, is it really the case that the system didn't give them the opportunity to save, or is it they made bad choices? Right now, of course, since capitalism is a system of freedom, that includes the freedom to make bad choices, but it also should include the freedom to say, you made a bad choice, and maybe next time you should make a better one, but it's not fair that you expect other people to be responsible for your bad choices.
So before I respond to the opening statement, Bryan, I do want to say one thing, that I don't think that the gains in inequality can be ascribed exclusively to real estate or construction, because, I mean, they do show up in like capital gains or measurements of wealth, but the data about inequality goes beyond that to just the sort of labor income. So it can't just be construction. But in any case, to respond to your opening statement, so I think that sort of measuring a country, I think it has some anthropological value, but measuring sort of the existence of a country by its sort of grocery stores doesn't really tell us a lot about that country. There would be other measurements to look at, like life expectancy or degrees of equality, or the extent that you can have class mobility. Nor does it, I think, suffice to say that, well, Swedish or American Swedes are more prosperous than Swedish Swedes for a number of different reasons. I mean, it ignores kind of economic history when those countries industrialized. But more important, I think that what that overlooks is that Sweden may well have made seemingly rational choices about which they value more, that is prosperity and efficiency, or security and some kind of other values. And so I guess it's just to sort of say that one of the things that I think we can beware of in this debate is thinking that prosperity is the absolute and the final measure of any given country and how well that country is succeeding. Obviously, it informs a great deal, and one would want to live in a prosperous country and not a poor one, but I wouldn't want to live in a country whose only value is prosperity. And here's my other sort of career as an English professor will come out. There's a great Walt Whitman quote, what is it that you made a lot of money? What is it that you got what you want? In other words, we have other values. And of course, if you have prosperity, you can choose how you want to pursue those values. But it's only to say that some countries make choices that put other values above prosperity. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad choice. I think, indeed, it's a choice that a lot of Americans would want to make. As to programs that can help everyone, or programs like Social Security and Medicare that help everyone and sort of needlessly help everyone and lead to waste when most people can take care of themselves, I think it's bad history. Because if you go back and look at the United States before it passed Medicare in 1965, 56% of Americans had some kind of hospital insurance coverage. That's a majority, I suppose, but it's not much of a majority. And I hate to think what that number would look like today without Medicare, because insurance in 1965 was relatively cheap. Now, I can't imagine very many health insurance companies wanting to touch people over age 65. So I think this is an example where a majority of people can't always take care of themselves when there are places in the market or that don't allow them to do that. Similarly, if you think of Social Security, Dan mentioned I just wrote a book on the 1930s. It wasn't that people before Social Security, so Social Security is a program that comes from the 1930s, it wasn't that people in the 1930s before Social Security arrived were taking care of themselves, or a majority of people were taking care of themselves. They were living with their children. That was Social Security. That was the retirement program. And we've made a trade-off, and we've said we don't think that that ought to be the case. Moreover, and I'm sure this would just offend Bryan or make him think even less of Social Security is broadly redistributive. That is that if you're poor, you end up getting more money back from it than you put in. And if you're rich, you end up getting slightly less money than you put into it before. So it has a redistributive function that's not just about taking care of everyone, but trying to correct whatever imbalances grew up over the course of one's life. Finally, I think when Bryan talks about individual freedom and voluntary consent and involuntary redistribution, to me, I I understand completely where this is coming from, and the idea and the ideal that you control the things that you have owned and earned. This is, some of you may have read like Robert Nozick or be more familiar with like libertarian theory, and this has an appeal. It has a built-in appeal. It kind of makes fundamental common sense. But to me, I think it ignores the role that luck plays in people's lives. Bryan mentioned, you don't have a choice which family you're born to. Yet we know which family you're born to determines so much of your life. Your odds of graduating from college. Right? So to me, the question becomes then, if the natural assets that you have, including a rich family, or even how hard you're able to work, or the reward you're able to see from hard work, if all of these things are the result of chance or luck, then it becomes much less of a given to me that you own the things that your body and your natural assets produce. Rather, you would have a kind of sense of provisional ownership over those. I could have been somebody else. I could have been born to a different family. I could have not had the natural assets that I did. And when you do that, then I think that it becomes more difficult to say, well, the government is taking what's mine and giving it to someone else. As soon as you admit the possibility of luck, then what's mine, I think, has less of an intellectual claim, or less of an urgent intellectual claim than it would otherwise.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we will have some time for your questions from the audience. But a few questions I've been thinking about that I think maybe many of you would like to hear our debaters respond to. So the first one would be, the communist regimes of the 20th century practiced socialism, but they were also authoritarian and repressive. From the Ukraine terror famine to the Berlin Wall, the Great Leap Forward to Cambodia's killing fields, the horrors of communism, I think, should never be forgotten. I think we should all remember this and what happened. But are the human rights violations of the communist regimes of the 20th century really relevant for the debate today? Many capitalists or many people, conservatives and libertarians, love to hit socialists over the head with the horrors of communism stick. And so are they relevant? And if so, why or why not? Open it up.
Yeah, so highly relevant in my view. First of all, unlike John, there are many unsophisticated socialists who speak big slogans which seem to imply the Soviet Union was in fact a better country, and just saying, well, when people took those slogans literally, it led to hell on earth, is a useful observation, right? And it also speaks to the historical ignorance of most people who call themselves socialists, that they know so little about this, which is striking that you would advocate a radical change in society without being aware of what occurred the last time people who use the same slogan have in mind. I'd also say that if you ever want to think of a microaggression, right, I would say that in a world where there are many people who lived under social regimes and suffered under them, such as my wife's parents, it is a bit of a microaggression to you to throw the word around and talk about how great it is as if their suffering never happened, right? So it does seem like just the fact that you use the word, it is an effort to go and antagonize people and make them worry. Now, I know John was sort of pressed into using the word, so he's innocent. But when people use the word socialism, I think they are deliberately choosing a word that they know has very bad connotations for many people, and they are acting as if the suffering that people endured under that never happened, so they shouldn't do that. So again, I'll go back to my work on the 1930s. And
a number of writers during that period wanted so desperately to believe that the Soviet Union had transcended capitalism and was the future, effectively. And the desire to believe that blinded them to so many things that actually were going on in the Soviet Union, and that they couldn't just simply say, I wasn't aware. So to my mind, as someone who studies that period, I think of that as like this sort of great, this period of an incredible willed ignorance and willed blindness. And so I'm especially careful, or especially wary of ever forgetting that period in American history, or not American history, but of world history, and of socialism generally. Now, that said, I think that, the people who are, that system was such a spectacular failure that I don't know how many people truly think that we should go back and do it. I think that there's some naivete about what those countries were, but I don't think that you'll find too many people saying we ought to look like the Soviet Union in the 1930s. We ought to have mass famines. We ought to imprison people. I would like to think that people have learned that lesson from history, and so this question to me has, on the one hand, we always need to keep that history in mind. On the other hand, by the fact of us keeping that history in mind, it would make it, I think, less relevant to what we choose to do in the future.
Okay. Margaret Thatcher wrote that, in her opinion, there were only two economic systems, free economic systems, and then what she called socialist Marxist systems, in which decisions affecting people's lives are taken from them instead of being taken by them. On the other hand, Karl Marx contended that the realm of freedom begins beyond the realm of necessity. And I think these quotes, and I think in many other cases, people on both sides of the debate seem to have contrasting views of freedom, and based on these views of freedom, see the other system as almost necessarily, by the nature of its operation, must be violating people's rights or people's freedom. Is there any moving beyond this impasse? Can we have a discussion here where we advance some kind of common understanding of what constitutes freedom, and then get to the question of, are we actually more likely, or what steps, what policy reforms could allow us to more closely realize this freedom here in the earth? John, you want to take this one first? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
I have a bleak view of human life. I think that it is an incredible amount of tragedy, and that there is no way around the inevitable awful things that will befall you at one point or another. All of which is to say, to put it positively, we never conquer necessity. There is no such thing as a pure freedom. And so I think the question then becomes, well, to the extent that we can carve out areas where we can increase our freedom a little bit. I'll probably repeat this statistic at some point. But there's a very famous study in political economy that shows that once people reach a wage, this is a few years ago now, so you'd have to account for inflation, but once people reach a wage, annual income of around $75,000 a year, their day-to-day emotional life does not get any better after that. In other words, people who make $75,000 a year are just as happy on a day-to-day basis as somebody who makes $1 million a year. Now, that doesn't mean that those who make more money don't have a more positive view of overall life satisfaction. That's the distinction that people sometimes forget about that study. But what it does show is that once you hit that $75,000 number, that your day-to-day life isn't really going to get much better. And I think that's because at $75,000, that's the point at which you no longer are terribly concerned about money. Will I be able to pay rent? Will I be able to have enough groceries this month for myself and my children? So I think if you define freedom kind of narrowly and say, what are we able to do to increase people's sense of general well-being and satisfaction without overstepping or stepping into areas where we don't really know what we're doing or that might lead to some kind of problems of the kind that Margaret Thatcher describes, then I think that those kinds of freedoms are very much within our grasp.
All right. So let me tell you something super non-bleak. In the very same research that John is talking about, most very poor people are happy too. The actual difference in happiness between rich people and poor people is small because poor people are actually generally happy too. So it's, which just goes back to the truths that the Greeks knew, which is that income and wealth, there's only one ingredient in a much bigger picture, and happiness is much more about your relationships with other people, the material things. And if you think that's a problem from my view, that's okay, because that's the fact. Now, on the question of is there any way that we can move past this impasse, see, actually there are a lot of socialists that have moved past it by saying, we don't care about freedom, we care about other things. And I'm happy with them in a sense because I think they're being forthright and they're saying we care more about equality than about freedom, we care more about cohesion than about freedom. They might even say we care more about happiness than freedom. To me, I would say that the Karl Marx story about freedom is when you move beyond necessity. That's just what any English professor will call Orwellian language. It's where you go and deliberately change the meaning of a word that everybody knows in order to equivocate and confuse people. Look, basic English. Robinson Crusoe alone on his island is completely free. He's super poor, he's lonely, he has 100 problems, but he's free. And that's just normal English. If there's no one around doing stuff to you, you've got freedom. You may say, well, is that really that great? And the answer is kind of. Depends. You need other things too, but freedom is really important. And furthermore, there's something, what's really special about freedom is this. Even when you know that you can make another person happier, it's generally wrong to go and take his freedom away from him. You probably know a bunch of people in your own life where you know better than they do what they should be doing, right? And yet you probably haven't gone and put them in a cage or tried to go and force them to do what you think should be done. You may have tried to persuade them. If you have a friend who drinks too much, you can say, hey, you're drinking too much, there's a problem, look at this, you're hurting your health, you're hurting me, you're hurting our friendship. You might even make threats and say, we can't be friends if you keep doing this. But that is short of saying, you are not allowed to drink, I am going to go and destroy all your alcohol and keep you from drinking again. Right? Freedom is the kind of thing where even when it doesn't bring happiness, it's morally very important to respect it. And then, for the Thatcher quote, that's just wrong. Right? There's more than two systems. There's a continuum, and that's the kind of hyperbole that politicians engage in, but I don't.
Okay. Adam Smith wrote that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. Well, Marx offered the slogan, from each according to ability, to each according to need. Whether through high taxes, universal basic income, guaranteed jobs, government ownership, socialism, to a large extent, is going to have a disconnect from individual compensation or remuneration and economic contribution, at least to some degree. So you have a question first on this issue for John. And so, does socialism face some kind of unavoidable economic incentive problem?
So to me, I have two responses to this. The first is, this sounds a little bit, and I don't think this is the spirit in which you're asking the question, but it sounds to me like the Charles Murray problem, which is that if you know Charles Murray, he wrote this book in the 1980s called Losing Ground, which was, the argument effectively was that just as the United States set out to do something about poverty by offering food stamps or increasing welfare, that it had no effect on poverty. And in fact, that the incentives then became for people to remain in poverty because then they didn't have to get a job. And the title kind of summarizes it all, that we tried to, the war on poverty tried to stop poverty, but we actually lost ground. And I find this kind of deeply dispiriting because in preparation for this debate, I read a whole bunch of books about sort of like what's wrong with socialism and books by those on the right who are arguing against socialism. And it's astonishing to me how much this Murray thesis still survives when I would have thought that it was kind of put to rest, indeed back upon its publication, which is that everyone did worse after the start on the war of poverty. It wasn't just the poor. And labor participation rates did not go down after the increase in welfare in the 1960s and 1970s. And moreover, perhaps it was a good thing if we allowed people, one of Murray's other theses is that welfare policies made an incentive for women not to get married or for women to divorce. And people were horrified when, after the war on poverty, divorce rates went up. Maybe it was good that divorce rates went up. This is a kind of freedom that we can talk about. Like, if your marriage is awful, you shouldn't have to be tied to someone whom you're miserable with. The other thing that I would say about, so that's about welfare policies, and I don't think that's the spirit of the question that you're asking, but about labor policies and incentives. And here I would say, particularly for the kind of socialist I am, a kind of social democrat, well, we can appeal to data here. Let's take Sweden, which has a much larger welfare state policies than we do. The labor participation rate in Sweden is 10% higher than the labor participation rate in the United States. In other words, labor participation rate describes the number of adults at working age between like 18 and 65 who have a job. So today, when you hear that the unemployment rate is quite low, it's down around 4% or something, what that obscures is there are a large portion of working age adults in the United States who don't look for work, and they don't count among the unemployment rate. Or if you take Denmark, its labor participation rate matches ours exactly. So I think that you can have a coexistence of a much larger state that's doing much more in terms of redistributive policies and not overly harm labor incentives. If, however, you don't buy that data, then I think that what you can do, and what a lot of those countries do, is have work incentives. So in the United States, we have the earned income tax credit. Why not make that much larger? In other words, that if you work, you're going to be rewarded much more for that work. I'm not convinced that that is necessary, but it would certainly be one response to it.
And I have a slight variation on this theme for Bryan, just specifically. Top U.S. individual income tax rates remained at around 90% after World War II until the time of the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts in 1964. During the 1950s and early 1960s, our economy did experience vigorous economic growth. Does this show that maybe big government may not necessarily create an overbearing incentive problem?
Yeah, so 2 points. So one is that almost no one paid those tax rates. So there is work on like what fraction of people actually pay the 90% tax rates. There were so many ways of getting your taxable income down that it is misleading. But again, the main thing I would say is that if you were to go and make a list of the incentive harming policies of the US government, tax policy is just way down the list. The things that are really hurting incentives are, first of all, as I said, regulations that prevent international mobility of workers. That is causing enormous destruction of wealth. Second of all, regulation of construction, which, John is right. It's not the sole cause of rising inequality, but a lot of work saying it is a very big chunk of it. And again, I don't think it's necessary for deregulation to solve the entire rise in inequality to be something that socialists should be interested in and say, hey, you make a good point. Let's go and all endorse this thing that reduces the power of government and increases affordable housing and improves access to jobs at the same time. So I'd say taxation is something where it's the effect of the tax rate upon work effort is, at least in the short run, quite a bit smaller than it seems. Quite a bit smaller than many people tell you, and I'm happy to go and agree to that because the government policies where it's easiest to criticize are often ones where those are not the biggest problems, and on the other hand, the ones that are causing huge damage are ones you've hardly ever heard of because they're not exciting. And how many people live their life grumbling about housing regulation, even though that is probably impoverishing the country by trillions of dollars, right? But this is not very interesting, and most people don't think about it. And then, just one other point on what John was saying. So it is true that some Scandinavian countries have higher labor force participation than the U.S. Hours of work per worker, however, are lower. So I'm amazed at how much data an English professor knows. So it's way more than a lot of people specialize. But the data is complicated, and that's unfortunate because we could have a whole discussion on the data, but it's complicated.
Can I add two things?
Sure.
So their overall hours worked are lower because they've chosen to work fewer hours. I mean, this is a decision that they've made. They've sacrificed productivity for another value. I see no harm in that whatsoever.
That is a story, or maybe they work less because the tax rate's so high.
That's grant that true. But I wanted to say something about the top tax rate, which is that The other argument that often goes against, or is that is in response to, well, we lived with a 90% top tax rate from 1950 to the mid-1980s or late 1970s, and we could go back to it. And one response is, well, that was a very different world. In other words, where the United States was the sole, the only kind of superpower, capitalist superpower anyway, and there was no risk of capital flight or people leaving, and you could tax people at that rate. I just don't know that that's true, or a very good description of what the effect of top tax rates are. Other countries have had equally high top tax rates, not been in the situation that the United States has been in, where they were the sole economic superpower, and it doesn't seem to have harmed growth all that much. So I mean, my own number, if you were asking, I think we can go 70% as a top income tax rate on income over $10 million. And now I say that, I don't think that that would harm growth. Now, whether we should do that as a policy, I mean, that's a different debate, but I don't think it has that much, I don't think it shows up that much in incentives or work or productivity.
Well, yeah, really quick point on that. So I agree, so if the tax rate were 70% today, I don't think you would see very large changes in the labor supply of the wealthy. If it stayed that way for decades, however, this gives a chance to all young people to go and totally rearrange their lives and do a job where you don't have to make a lot of money. Right? And in the long run, I think there is a lot of harm, and here's the problem. It's really hard to do empirical work on long-run effects, but that doesn't mean they're not there.
Okay. Proponents of capitalism will often remark that what's called socialism today is really nothing more than a generous welfare state with a market economy. And I think, John, you've said much of that. But leaving aside any elements of marketing or wanting to rebrand the welfare state under the term socialism, perhaps, is there anything, do you see any crucial differences between the American welfare state as it was in the past, but just perhaps more generous, and what people see in socialism in America today or possibly going forward? And John, I guess so if you start with this and then Bryan.
So I think that there are differences between the welfare state that exists in the United States and the welfare state that exists abroad. And the differences are the one that I think annoy Bryan the most. And what I mean by that is that a lot of welfare state policies in social democratic countries in Europe, that the difference between those and the ones in the United States is that the ones in the United States are principally targeted at a minority of the population, whereas a lot of social welfare policies and programs in European countries are universal. So, for example, there would be a universal tax credit for a child. So per child, regardless of what your income is, then because the state has an incentive, because the state wants you to have children, because this helps economic growth, and they want to make it as just as possible for everyone to participate, for everyone to work, women included, then they offer child tax credits. In the United States, if we had something similar, it would be targeted at the poor. You can see a similar kind of effect with welfare policies. Right? They're targeted at the poor. And I think one of the problems with this that we've seen is that when welfare state policies are targeted exclusively at the poor, then that tends to undermine support for them. And you may say that's fine, maybe the support should be undermined for them, or people should not support them. But contrast that with something like Medicare, which is a universal program. And you've seen the effects when somebody starts talking about, well, we're going to cut Medicare, this is a non-starter. So I think to me, one of the principal differences, and just to sum up, between American welfare state programs and policies and other welfare state programs and policies is the audience at which they're targeted, or the demographic at which they're targeted. And for my own money, I think, with some exceptions, that universal programs are better, but because they have more support and people feel more invested in them. But I also recognize that that's sometimes a tough sell to people who think, as Bryan put it, that I can take care of myself perfectly well, I don't need these other programs.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say there's no fundamental difference. It's all just movement along a continuum. The US has a huge welfare state. Europe has a huge, European countries generally have huge welfare states, so usually huger, Switzerland maybe not. Main differences, like I said, I agree that European welfare states have even more universal programs, And again, just to make the point clear, if you were a philanthropist and you wanted to give away $1 billion, would you say, well, let's see, there's 7 billion people on Earth, I got $1 billion, I guess I'll give everyone a seventh of a cent. That makes sense. I mean, if you were advising them, I think you would say that is a crazy way to spend $1 billion. There are starving people. Why are you going and spreading the wealth around to a bunch of people who are perfectly able to take care of themselves? Instead, find the really severe problems and target those problems. Focus on those. When you solve those, move on to some other one. So what I'll say is that while I am not a fan of the welfare state at all, at least ones where it's very targeted towards people who are genuinely poor, especially kids, people who are poor through no fault of their own, at least I understand the case. The case for just going and throwing money at everyone, to me, it really is just the cynical one of, well, this is the only one we can get people behind it, is to trick them, right? And it's saying, not only is that very wasteful, it's not even true. There are lots of programs that have been very stable that go and help the poor, and I don't see why you would think that other similar ones couldn't exist. But I would actually go further and say the system is even worse than that, and including the U.S., because really what we have is not a specific choice. Okay, this is going to be a society where we target our welfare benefits more narrowly on the poor. Europe's one where it's more universal. It's really more of chaos, where we just have a whole bunch of policies that work that do very different things. We have a whole lot of regulations that go and increase the wealth of people who own homes in the highest income areas of the country. And again, why is this? Well, partly it's because the only people who get to vote in these elections are the people who live in these areas. That is part of it. Although you can also see that public opinion on this is just crazy. And so the recent poll in California, only about 13% of Californians agree that building more houses will reduce housing prices. So again, this is something where virtually any economist will say, well, of course it will. And yet California, a state that I'm from, so I'll say one of the least economically literate regions I've ever known, right? People there say, no, whoa, you can build all the houses you want. Nothing, we won't get cheaper. It's what are you crazy? Of course it will, right? But you can see, another example, the U.S. has college savings accounts. Many of your parents may have paid for these. These are this is a special tax shelter that is used almost entirely by the upper middle and rich. So again, it's not that we have some well-designed system. Rather, we just have, a giraffe, which is notoriously a horse designed by committee, and that's really what the system is. It's not well-designed for anything.
Can I add one thing, which is that I'm not sure that the philanthropist analogy is quite right, because that involves somebody who has money themselves and then choosing how to distribute it. But in a program like Social Security or Medicare, your money gets taxed and you receive the bulk of it back. So you might say that this increases kind of inefficiency in some way, or you might object to the redistributive policies of those programs, but it's inapt to say that there's a philanthropist giving money away and he's giving it to the wrong people. Everyone's making their contribution and getting back a share of it. So I'm not sure that's quite right. I mean,
it's an accounting fiction. There's nothing in the fact that you pay that tax that means they have to give you anything.
Well, but they do. I mean, you receive Social Security back.
Right. So, Bryan, your last response was getting into this, but I think is something I'd like to go a little bit more. The democratic socialists, from my perspective, seem to gloss over or ignore some of the problems that exist with representative democracy, that public choice economists have identified over the decades. Even though these problems, I think, arguably are behind some of the things that you brought up, John, about opposition to, or a lot of support for the minimum wages, yet it doesn't get raised. Now, Dr. Caplan has made an enormous contribution to the literature in his research, and so I'd like to have him respond to this question first by talking a little bit about his idea of rational irrationality, and then I'd like both of you to respond to whether real-world democracy would be capable of implementing socialism in America in anything like the way that socialists might have in mind.
So rational rationality. The idea of this is that when you actually look at human beings, the level of intellectual discipline that they apply to their analysis seems to depend upon incentives. Not just how much information they acquire, but just the way that they think. And my favorite example of this is when someone shoots their mouth off and claims, for example, Hillary's going to win the 2000 election for sure. Actual prominent pundit said this. And then someone, say me, comes along and says, okay, you're really sure? Then let's bet at 10-1 odds. And this is where people run for the hills, right? And it seems that actually the offer to bet it's not that it just shows that people were lying or claimed to have more knowledge than they really did. It actually makes people think about the world in a different way, and it leads them to say, well, gee, I guess I wasn't really thinking that clearly. I need to calm down and say something that's more defensible. So anyway, and I see this as being a fundamental problem with democracy, which is that you can vote on the basis of any ideas that you want, because if you vote for nonsense, what happens to you? You as an individual get exactly the same policies that you otherwise would. So if one Californian ignores the fact that more housing will reduce the price of housing in California, what happens to him? The same thing that would happen to him otherwise, because he's just one vote. And yet, of course, if the general majority of Californians refuse to believe that more housing will reduce housing prices, then you can get the actual California housing California housing policy, which is terrible, and basically means that you've got to live hours away from a high-wage area if you want to get a good job, or you can just settle and not have a good job, or you can pay 70% of your income in rent. So, all of your options in the progressive state of California. Right now, in terms of what we can realistically expect from what happens under socialism, or Democrat, or social democracy, I mean, I'd say there, the best thing is to look at actual countries that already have it. And I'd say that you've got the relatively well-run ones, like in Scandinavia, where they have huge welfare states and they have huge taxes to pay for it. And so they're stable, right? They're mediocre, but they're stable. And then you have countries like Greece that want to have Scandinavian policies, but don't want to have Scandinavian tax rates, and they're complete disasters. Now, which country is the United States more like? I think the United States is a lot more like Greece, right? We're the kind of country where, even if we had an enormous amount of government spending, we would still be really resentful of taxes, and so we would just do it the Greek way. So yeah, I would say it's not fundamentally impossible for the U.S. to be like Scandinavia, but those are your best case scenarios. And given the Americans' cultural aversion for taxation, even if we did have a whole lot of government spending, we'd probably keep taxes low until we reach fiscal crisis. And when I say probably, this is actually the path we're already on. So I think you guys should be expecting fiscal crisis in 20 or 30 years. And actually, I guess I should too. I'll be alive, but I'm getting almost all my money into Roth, so I won't pay any taxes on that. So tough luck for you guys.
So I'll only address the second half of the question about the sort of the possibilities for the United States to become a more social democratic country. And I think I've already returned to it once or twice, but I'm sorry, it's in my head, it's on my brain. And that's the 1930s, which is when, if you think about policies that did the most to help workers in the United States and to push the United States in a social democratic direction, a lot of those policies came in the 1930s. I've mentioned Social Security, but there's also the Wagner Act, which made it much more possible for workers to form unions. I think one difference between the United States and social democratic countries in Europe is that in those countries, many, many, many more workers are protected by unions, and this has an incredible and not unexpected result for their income and their sense of economic security. But what brought about those changes was, and I suppose this would sound kind of classically Marxist to Marxists, was crisis. And it seems to be in those moments of crises that these kinds of policies happen. Now, having said that, it's also the case that when countries feel kind of prosperous, they are also, like if you think of the mid-1960s when we had Medicare and the war on poverty, that people don't need crises to become more generous to others. But I think that, to get to the bottom of your question, I think that if you survey people, if you ask them, would you like to have this policy? Would you like to raise the minimum wage? They say yes. Or would you like to have, should everyone have health care? They say yes. In other words, most people in the United States, a majority, would already prefer to live in a social democratic country. So the question then becomes, why don't they? Or why don't we? And to me, that's not a failure of those people. It's a failure of the way that we have set up democracy in the United States, that it doesn't reflect those people's wills and their desires. And in some cases, I agree with Bryan, housing restrictions is a foolish policy, but I don't think that represents well the rationality of most people. I think that's perfectly rational for them to say a $7.25 minimum wage is too low, or I want more health care, and I think we can pay for this by taxing the rich. In other words, I don't think that those are irrational policies. The irrationality, if there is one, lies in the disconnection between people's desires and what the government actually does for them.
Yeah. Those answers that John just attributed to average Americans, I say those are true, and I consider those to be prime examples of what I'm talking about. A reasonable person, when you say, should there be health care for all, doesn't say, oh yeah, that sounds good. They say, how much is it going to cost? What is the estimated effect of additional health care on life expectancy? They ask the kinds of questions that no normal human being would ask because they are emotional people who just give the answer that sounds good. And again, that's the road to disaster, because emotional answers that sound good are just often wrong.
Want to give some time for you all to ask some questions. We have a mobile microphone, so if you want to ask a question, stand up or raise your hand, and then we'll have to have somebody get around to you with the microphone. And then if you want to ask a question for both, ask your question, and then if you want to direct it to one of the speakers, let us know, or you can say it's for both.
Testing, can you hear me?
Yep.
How do you address the future of technology in either your topics? It seems like the advancement of technology will cause an entirely new economic system. What would you call that if a religion doesn't stay in the way?
So I hope you're right. I hope that we can get great new technology that will make life a lot better. The actual pattern seems to be that technological progress has been slower for the last 40 years than it was in the previous 40 years. How can this be when there's so many news stories about robots? Because you write news stories about stuff that isn't actually very important. If you don't write news stories about stuff that is important, important stuff is boring.
Other question.
Hi. So first of all, thank you both for coming out today. I'm in the MA program in economics here, and my big thing is studying institutions and how they evolve. So my big question is sort of, looking at the 1930s and comparing it to now, right? And I think we've seen sort of an evolution of institutions across all countries. So how do we take that into account how do we include this sort of the evolution of institutions in this debate between social democracy and capitalism, and how does it affect your answers?
Well, can you say a word about what you mean by institutions? Like, which institutions do you have in mind?
Sure. So just, I tend to associate institutions with the more informal things, so like the culture and things that sort of govern modern societal behavior. And there are formal institutions as well, so like the rule of law. But so I guess it's more like things like culture, so sort of like language, whatnot, prevalent political ideas amongst society. And so how the evolution of that, from, say like the 1930s to now, how that's sort of affected this debate.
In English we have words for this like, borrowing from Marxism like ideology and from anthropology like culture. In other words, how people imagine the world that they live in and the language that they use to describe it. I think that, so let me give you an example maybe that I think speaks to what you're talking about, but might do it specifically whereas you want a general answer. So to my mind, some of the most interesting research about this question is about what exactly happened historically that these European countries became social democracies, whereas the United States didn't. And I think some of the most fascinating research is that what those social democratic countries had was relative kind of cultural and racial homogeneity. In other words, everyone kind of looked like each other. Whereas in the United States, there is much more anxiety about race. And one argument for why the United States never developed into a social democratic country is because of, frankly, white racism. That they didn't want, that is whites, didn't want an enormous welfare state because then that would be helping what they would have called those people. And so I think maybe to answer your question, that was the case in the 1930s, but it has become increasingly the case since the civil rights movement, and I don't think it's something that you can ignore. Indeed, I think it explains a lot.
Yes, I would just say that even using the word evolution has connotations of progress, and like what I think we can say for sure is that the world has changed over time, and then as to whether that change has been good or bad depends, is case by case, and you got to look at the individual changes, and some things are good and some things are bad. And again, sort of like when you use the word evolution, it makes it sound like something happened and then it became a good idea to do something else. And I just don't see that being generally true for policy. In business, it's very different. In business, when you see there's a change, there's generally a very good reason. Well, we started going and shipping because shipping costs went down, or because the regulations changed that allowed us to do it. But like for government policy, I just see very little sign that it's adaptive. And even for culture as well, I don't see much sign that culture is adaptive, because culture isn't something that any one individual chooses. Sometimes it's an improvement, sometimes it's worse. It's complicated.
Is there another?
I think we need to be realistic and really think about these youth in here, what kind of world they're going to inherit. I mean, we're having a debate in Alabama right now what we should do about plastic bags, okay? Which system, which form of economics do you think will be best at addressing this global crisis of the Arctic is breaking off, okay? It's melting. We have plastics destroying our oceans. Which system do you think best addresses that problem?
Yeah, so I would just say I have a high standard for crisis, so I don't think there's a crisis. There are a bunch of different problems. So global warming problem, plastic bags seems to me to be so far down the list of problems in the world. I think you'd have to go down to like problem 1 million or something before I'd be worrying about that one. In terms of which system is best able to address it, that's one where I think it's best to actually just go and look at different capitalist and socialist countries around the world. Usual answer is that the more capitalist countries globally are a lot cleaner because they're a lot richer, and richer countries, first of all, they've got more, they got more environmental regulation, but second of all, there's also richer people just aren't as filthy, right? So when people are poor, they're not worried about making things really dirty. When they're rich, they are. So I'd say overall, rich countries are going to be cleaner. And then finally, just like in terms of what could capitalism do about the problems that are serious, things like global warming. Here, there's a whole field called environmental economics where they talk about it. And the main answer comes down to throw away your phone book of regulations and put a tax on the thing that's bad. And then if you don't want to pay the tax, then you have to figure out a way of cheaply avoiding the problem. So this is the kind of thing that environmental economists have been talking about for a long time. It's very unpopular with most environmentalists, but not really for any good reason. The work on the effectiveness of these kinds of approaches is that you can get a lot more bang for your buck by taxing environmental harms than you can by imposing regulations, a lot of which won't be followed anyway.
So here, I have two things to say about this, which is that as far as the problem of global warming goes, to me, this is a situation that illustrates why you need kind of both capitalism and socialism, or what we're calling socialism, so sort of social democratic policies. Because I agree with Bryan 100% that if there's something that's bad, you tax it. In this case, carbon. And this, I think, is pretty much the economic consensus. What's the Nordhaus, William Nordhaus? Yeah, he gets I mean, this is sort of settled science. Now, the question becomes, like, why don't we do that? And to me, that's when you need more social democracy than you do capitalism. Because the fact that we have not been able to generate any urgency to do that, I lay at the door of capitalism. And so while the policy itself, I think, is a perfect illustration of how you mix these things, tax carbon. And then you will lead companies to either use less carbon or to have technologies, to invent technologies that will get rid of it. But the fact that we haven't done this thing, that we haven't done what everyone seems to have agreed, that's a problem of capitalism. That's a problem of democracy that I think has been corrupted by capitalism.
Oh, yeah. And I say again, it just goes back to voter rationality. Voters like to have a phone book of regulations because they think that businesses pay for that. And whereas carbon taxes, on the other hand, I would have to pay for that. So I remember like early in the Obama administration, he said, well, we need to figure out a way of raising the price of carbon to companies but not to consumers. It's like, if it doesn't go for consumers, they're going to want just as much. So like that's not going to work. Like you've got to stop demagoguing and say, look, the problem is we're doing too much of this thing. And yeah, that means you too. It's not just evil corporations that are doing too much. It's humans that are doing too much. But try going to voters and making that case. And I say this is why social democracy fails, is that people like feel-good solutions. They like innumeracy, right? Innumeracy, not numeracy, right? And so it's just a deep flaw in democracy itself.
Okay, well, we've come to time for our closing statements. We're going to let Bryan close first, and then John gets the last word because Bryan got the first word in the debate.
All right. Yep. So I feel this is a very hopeful debate. I feel like I could work something out with John. And I don't get this feeling often. The last time I had this debate, I felt like, wow, you didn't talk about the last 2 centuries. Those should have been addressed. But yeah, so John's slogan of capitalism that works for everyone, it's a great slogan. I love this slogan, right? But this doesn't mean that we need to have more government. It means that we need to look at what governments actually do. And when we see what governments actually do, even in countries that get called capitalist, governments do a whole lot of bad stuff that exacerbate the problems that John is talking about. Like I said, I mentioned housing regulation, and I'll mention it again. Actually, I talk about this almost every day to anyone who will listen, because this is something where it's so obvious. There's a lot of regulations that make it really hard to build housing, especially in high-wage areas of the country, which means that you price a lot of the population out of those areas, so people can't afford good homes and can't move to jobs that are good. And again, and for what? Right? Just because of these delusions about, there's no connection between housing and housing prices or something like that. Right? And again, I also mentioned, I don't think John, I haven't gotten John to bite on immigration, but really he should. So again, he's mentioning the diversity of the United States. A lot of this comes from immigration, right? And I say, this is the great humanitarian contribution of the United States is the historic welcomeness to immigrants. Probably most of our ancestors wouldn't have even been here if it weren't for this. This is a big part of the American tradition. Again, this is why we can really look back on this age of open immigration, and, not as a period of the horrors of capitalism. I stand by that period. Right, the Gilded Age, this is one where, yes, there's very little welfare state, but it's also one where, except for people from China and Japan, really anyone on earth can come here and make a life for themselves, and they did. All right, so, capitalism works for everyone. So, people right now can't afford, have trouble affording a home or being able to be commutable to a high-wage job. That can be solved with less government. Letting people around the world move to opportunity, that can be solved with less government, right? And then, like I said, so, if there is going to be a welfare state, the one that makes sense is to focus the money on actual desperately poor people, right? Not do the European thing where you just throw the money around like a drunken sailor, but to say, look, we've got a budget here. Let's go and find the actual people who are really suffering, and let's get the money to them. Which again, honestly, if we were really doing this, we would be spending almost nothing in the United States. We'd be going to war zones and helping war orphans. We'd be dealing with child nutrition. We'd be going and getting vaccinations to kids in poor countries. I'd say, that is the very least objectionable thing that government could do. Of course, there's very little of it because even when people talk about how they care about everyone, they really don't care very much about people outside of their home country, right? And that's a lot of what capitalism does, is it creates opportunity for people that people don't care about very much, right? So, for example, something like 80% of all people of all Haitians who escape poverty don't live in Haiti, right? So they move to the United States, and Americans don't care enough about Haiti to go and solve their problem, but they haven't completely choked off immigration, which means that Haitians can come and work their way up. Now, in terms of fundamental philosophical difference, so it does come down to, with John, I get the feeling of after we do all the things we agree on, John's still not going to be happy. So after we get rid of all the regulations that where government is increasing poverty and inequality on purpose, and there's a lot, right? But once we do that, then I think John will still be malcontent, and I will be doing my victory lap and saying this is great, right? And what's the difference is that, part of the problem in life is bad policy causing poverty. Another part of the problem, though, is that people make bad choices, right? This is part of human freedom to be able to make bad choices, but it's also part of human freedom to be able to say, you made a bad choice and I don't understand why I should have to go and pay for this. This is something that almost everyone deals with in their own life. Almost everyone has a friend or relative who wants to parasitize on them. and wants to take advantage, right? And when it's someone who's been sleeping on your couch for 3 weeks, and every day they say, I just can't find a job, man, right? Well, first few days, maybe it's true, but after a while, you may start to wonder and say, well, really? There's really nothing you can do? Like there's another line like, wait, how did you get on my couch in the first place? What were you doing before then? I'd like a full accounting of what's going on, because it seems to me there's probably a lot of things that you could have done, better choices you could have made. And while you're free to do these bad choices, I don't see why strangers should be legally obliged to pick up the slack when you make bad ones. Thank you.
So there's a literary critic, his name is Frederick Jameson, he's a famous literary critic. And he once commented that it is easier for Americans today to imagine the end of the world than it is for them to imagine the end of capitalism. And you can see this. We have so many apocalyptic films where the world is ending, but comparatively few films that tries to imagine a world significantly different than ours. And I pull that quote out because I say I am a social democrat, but I have to confess that at least part of me is still just a plain old-fashioned socialist. If, that is, by socialism, we mean something that aims beyond equality and benefits and services to a fundamental transformation of society. I simply cannot believe that capitalism represents the final stage in human evolution, including economic evolution. Likewise, I cannot believe that human beings were made to work for 40 hours a week at jobs they dislike, if that is, they are lucky enough to hold a job. Let me add one more definition to socialism then. Not collective ownership or control, not just equality in services and benefits, but the suspicion that history has not stopped. A better world is possible, one that will look fundamentally different than capitalism. I cannot predict what form that world will take. Perhaps the robots do take our jobs, and a universal basic income leads to everyone sharing equally in economic growth. Perhaps humans will someday figure out how to control the means of production and distribution without it devolving into stagnation, dictatorship, and mass murder. In any case, I do not want to surrender the hope for that better, different world. I just think we stand so far away from that world right now that it does not do much good to call for it or to try to describe it. But that does not mean we shouldn't keep it alive in our imaginations. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, for setting this all up.
Thank you all for attending, and we'll have this, if you're here for extra credit, we'll have the sign-in sheets out here in just a moment, but let's give our speakers one last round of applause. Thank you.